The carriage wheels ground to a violent halt against the frozen earth. The sound was sharp. It cracked like shattered bones in the dead of winter. The journey to the isolated northern wastes had taken 3 agonizing days, but Lyra did not shiver. The air had turned to glass in her lungs. She sat perfectly still in the dark, wooden cabin, her hands folded neatly over the coarse fabric of her worn grey dress. She had been cast out, exiled from the warm, sunlit courts of the south, discarded like a broken tool when the High Lords deemed her bloodline useless. The rejection ceremony was supposed to break her. They had expected her to weep. They had waited for her to fall to her knees on the marble floor of the grand cathedral, to beg the council for mercy, to plead for a place among the lowest servants just to stay within the pack's borders. She did none of those things. She had simply unclasped the silver pendant of her former house, laid it quietly on the altar, walked out into the biting wind. Her silence had been her only armor. Lyra pushed open the carriage door and stepped out into the howling blizzard. Before her loomed Blackwood Keep. It did not look like a castle built for the living. It was a mausoleum carved from the bones of the earth. Jagged towers of obsidian stone pierced the dark, bruised sky, casting long, menacing shadows over the frozen tundra. The wind hit her like a physical blow, tearing at her clothes, desperate to drag her down into the snow. But the young woman merely lowered her chin and stepped forward. Massive icicles hung from the parapets like the fangs of a starving beast. There were no banners snapping in the wind, no warm lanterns lighting the courtyard. The entire fortress radiated an aura of absolute, suffocating grief. She pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. She carried no heavy luggage, only a single leather satchel containing her books. Hidden deep beneath her skin, suppressed by years of iron discipline, the golden fate thread pulsed faintly. It was a dormant spark of weaver magic, a rare and ancient power capable of mending shattered souls. It was a secret that could get her killed if discovered by the wrong sovereign. The heavy iron gates groaned open, revealing a sliver of pale yellow light. A woman stood in the entryway, shivering violently, despite being wrapped in 3 layers of thick wool. Mrs. Martha possessed a face deeply lined with perpetual anxiety, her eyes darting nervously toward the dark corners of the hall. Her hands constantly wrung a tarnished silver locket around her neck. She stared at the new arrival with wide, frightened eyes, looking as though she expected a ghost to step out of the storm rather than a governess. "You are the new one," the older woman whispered. Her voice trembled, barely audible over the roaring wind. Lyra stepped over the freezing threshold. "I am Lyra." The heavy oak doors slammed shut. The blizzard was cut off, but the temperature inside the great hall was barely any warmer. Ice coated the edges of the ancient tapestries. The breath of the few passing servants plumed white in the dim air. They moved like shadows, heads bowed, terrified of making a sound. The overwhelming scent of Blackwood Keep hit her instantly, a heavy mix of damp stone, burning cedarwood, and the sharp, metallic tang of frozen blood. "You are too young," Mrs. Martha muttered, shaking her head as she led the way down a cavernous, dimly lit corridor, "and far too quiet. The others who came before you. Scholars from the high citadels, strict masters with iron rods. They all left screaming, or weeping." The young governess followed, her footsteps making absolutely no sound on the icy stone. She did not ask why. She merely observed the frozen tear streaks carved into the faces of the massive wolf statues lining the hall. "He is not a normal pup," Mrs. Martha continued, casting a terrified glance over her shoulder. "Prince Wren. He is 7 years old, but his eyes, they belong to something ancient. He does not speak. He has never spoken a single syllable since the day he was born. The maids call him an abomination." "A child is not an abomination," Lyra replied softly. Mrs. Martha stopped dead in her tracks. She turned around, her expression entirely grim. "You have not met him. He knows things he shouldn't know. He sees things. He will break you, just as he broke the 5 royal scholars before you. They tried to teach him etiquette, history, mathematics. He just stared at them until their minds unraveled. The last Grand Master ran out into the snow without his boots, screaming about amber eyes." Lyra's face remained an unreadable mask. "A mistake is when you do not know what you are doing. A choice is when you do, and you do it anyway. The previous scholars had chosen to let their fear rule them. She would not." "Where is he?" she asked. In the Eastern Library, Mrs. Martha pointed a trembling finger toward a set of towering double doors at the end of the hall. "King Alaric is away at the border. He will not return until nightfall. You have until then to decide if you value your sanity enough to run." Lyra nodded once. She walked past the frightened housekeeper without another word. The stone walls seemed to close in around her. The biting cold seeped straight through the thin soles of her shoes. She could feel the ambient magic in this place. It was heavy, oppressive, tinged with a dark, unnatural chill. Rumors in the south spoke of a dark hex turning the Alpha's heart to solid ice, the Frostheart curse. She had dismissed it as campfire folklore, but now, feeling the cold radiating from the very foundation of Blackwood Keep, she knew the terrifying truth. She stopped before the heavy oak doors of the Eastern Library. The wrought iron handles were shaped like snarling wolves. The metal stung cold against her palms. She pushed them open. The massive library was dead silent, save for the crackle of the hearth. Lyra stepped inside. The doors clicked shut behind her. The room was a staggering cathedral of forgotten lore. Bookshelves soared 40 feet into the vaulted ceiling, their upper rows lost in impenetrable shadow. Ancient grimoires bound in cracked leather and scrolls sealed with brittle wax lined the walls. Moonlight filtered through stained glass windows, casting fractured patterns of blue and silver across the stone floor. At the far end of the room, near a roaring but heatless fire, sat a child. Prince Wren was seated behind a mahogany desk 3 times his size. He was perfectly still. He did not look up when the doors closed. He did not flinch. His small, pale hands carefully turned the fragile pages of a massive, leather-bound tome. The governess walked slowly toward him. With every step she took, the temperature plummeted further. The air around the boy visibly shimmered with unnatural cold. Thick layers of ice coated the edges of the desk, creeping down the wooden legs to freeze the rug beneath him. When she stopped a few feet away, Prince Wren finally lifted his head. His eyes were rare, molten amber. They stood out in sharp, startling contrast against his porcelain skin and raven-black hair. But it wasn't the color that made Lyra's breath catch in her throat. It was the intelligence. The boy stared at her with a chilling ancient awareness. It was the calculated gaze of an apex predator, assessing a threat, not a child looking at a new tutor. He had already driven 5 grown scholars to madness. Looking into those amber eyes, she instantly understood why. The sheer weight of his stare was suffocating, peeling back layers of pretense in a matter of seconds. Lyra didn't know the Alpha King could see through glamours, but as the sun's amber gaze locked onto hers, she realized this royal bloodline possessed a terrifying, absolute clarity. She did not offer a nervous smile. She did not try to coax him with sweet, patronizing words. She simply set her leather satchel down on the edge of the frozen desk. "I am Lyra," she stated. Her voice was steady, a quiet anchor in the vast freezing room. The pup did not blink. He slowly closed the book he was reading. The faded gold title caught her eye. It was an advanced text on esoteric magic and spiritual severance. It was meant for high priests and battle mages, not a 7-year-old child. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a standard primer, a simple book on basic arithmetic and royal etiquette. She placed it gently on the table. Prince Wren looked at the primer. Then he looked back at her. His expression remained perfectly blank, but a distinct aura of dismissal radiated from his small frame. He reached out with one finger and pushed the primer off the edge. It hit the stone floor with a loud, echoing thud. Lyra did not react. She did not scold him. She merely watched him, her posture relaxed but vigilant. The boy opened the drawer of the desk. He pulled out a piece of white chalk and a small slate. He began to write. The scratching sound echoed loudly, cutting through the eerie silence of the library. He turned the slate around. Too simple. "You already know the curriculum," she noted softly. He nodded once, slowly, deliberately. He then pulled out a complex architectural map of the northern mountain passes. The parchment was covered in strategic military markings and intricate magical ley lines. He pointed to a specific intersection of runic symbols near the border, then looked up at her. Tilting his head slightly, he was testing her. He wanted to see if she could spot the deliberate, fatal flaw in the warding matrix. Lyra leaned in. The cold radiating from his small body bit into her cheeks like needles. She studied the complex web of ink. The previous tutors had likely tried to force him to read nursery rhymes, entirely blind to the fact that Prince Ren possessed a genius-level intellect. "The runic anchor on the eastern ridge is misplaced," she said, her tone factual. "It disrupts the flow of the earth magic. If a rival army marched through that valley, the ward would shatter upon impact, causing a localized avalanche." For a fraction of a second, the amber eyes widened, a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker of surprise. Then the child erased his slate. He wrote out a complex mathematical equation relating to astronomical alignments and magical resonance. He pushed it toward her across the ice-covered wood. Lyra picked up her own piece of chalk. She solved the equation in 3 swift lines, her handwriting elegant and sharp. She slid the slate back. The grand library fell completely silent again. The fire popped and hissed, fighting a losing battle against the boy's unnatural chill. Prince Ren stared at the solved equation. He stared at the quiet woman standing before him. He knew every lesson in her books. He had known them for years. He had purposely played the part of the mute, broken monster to drive the fools away. He wasn't looking for a teacher. Lyra observed the subtle tremors in his small, pale fingers. Despite his terrifying intellect, he was still a child trapped inside a freezing body. The dark magic that plagued his father was clearly bleeding into him through the pack bond. His lips were tinged with blue. His knuckles were bone-white. The sheer crushing isolation of his existence hit her like a physical blow. He had been locked away in this towering room, surrounded by adults who feared him, who called him an abomination, who tried to force him to conform to a standard he had far outgrown. He was starving for someone who could meet him on his own level. No soul is too shattered to deserve salvation. Lyra kept the thought locked safely in her mind. She stood perfectly still, refusing to let an ounce of pity show on her face. Pity was useless to a wolf. Respect was what he demanded, and respect was what she gave. The staccato rhythm of the grandfather clock in the corner ticked away the heavy minutes. Prince Ren set the chalk down. He folded his hands neatly in his lap. The test of intellect was over. He had confirmed she was not an idiot. Now he needed to confirm something far more dangerous. The silence stretched between them, thick and pregnant with unspoken words. The young prince reached deep into the inside pocket of his dark velvet coat. His movements were incredibly slow, cautious, as if he were handling a highly volatile explosive. He withdrew a tightly rolled piece of ancient parchment. The edges were singed black. The material itself seemed to thrum with a dark, heavy resonance. He unrolled it flat on the desk. Lyra recognized it instantly. The air around her turned to solid ice. Her pulse hammered frantically in her throat, but she forced her breathing to remain perfectly even. It was the blank blood treaty, an artifact of supreme ancient binding magic, strictly outlawed in the southern territories. It required physical blood to seal an absolute unbreakable pact. Once signed, this sacred artifact could not be severed without the gruesome death of the betrayer. It was a sovereign document, carrying the ultimate weight of the moon goddess herself. The child slid the cursed parchment across the wood. It stopped exactly an inch from her fingertips. He picked up his slate again. The scratching of the chalk was much faster now, frantic, betraying a sudden, desperate urgency beneath his cold exterior. When he turned the slate around, the words made her heart stop. "I know what you hide." The young woman stared at the white chalk. She did not move. She did not gasp. Prince Ren erased the board violently. He wrote again, "The golden fate thread, Weaver." The massive room seemed to tilt. For 5 long years, Lyra had guarded her secret with her very life. Weaver magic was considered a myth to the common folk, but a terrifying reality to the ruling sovereign classes. A true weaver could manipulate the invisible lines of destiny, mend shattered spiritual cores, and unbind the darkest of blood curses. If the wrong alpha discovered her existence, she would be dragged into a dungeon and used as a magical battery until her body gave out. Yet here, in the isolated, freezing keep of the desolate north, a 7-year-old boy had unraveled her entire existence in a single afternoon. She looked deeply into the boy's amber eyes. There was no malice in them. There was no political calculation. There was only a profound, crushing desperation of a son watching his world die. He erased the board one last time. His small, freezing hand trembled violently as he formed the final, agonizing sentence. Cure him, or we all freeze. Lyra slowly raised her eyes from the dusty slate to the trembling child. The Frostheart curse. The lethal disease that was slowly turning King Alaric's chest to solid ice. The hex that had plunged Blackwood Keep into this eternal, unnatural winter. Prince Wren wasn't looking for a tutor to teach him history. He was looking for a weaver to save his father's life. He had driven the others mad on purpose. He had orchestrated the hiring of endless new scholars, filtering through them one by one, waiting for the exact moment when someone whose spiritual signature radiated warmth walked through the door. "If I touched the blank blood treaty," Lyra whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling hearth, "my life is permanently bound to yours. If I fail, the magic will consume me from the inside out." Prince Wren did not nod. He simply reached into his coat again and placed a small silver dagger on top of the binding contract. Its hilt was intricately carved with the roaring crest of Blackwood Keep. He was offering her a choice: run back into the deadly blizzard, or bleed for a royal family she did not know. She stared at the gleaming blade. The rejection ceremony in the south had been designed to break her spirit, to strip her of her pack and her pride. She had come to the frozen north, seeking a quiet, forgotten corner of the world to disappear forever. But destiny, it seemed, possessed a brutal sense of irony. She looked at the child. His lips were entirely blue now. His small chest he heaved with the sheer exhausting effort of fighting the ambient chill radiating from his own bloodline. He was a prince of the realm, yes, but right now he was just a terrified boy, trying to keep his father breathing. She reached out. Her fingers hovered over the silver handle. The exact moment her skin brushed the cold metal, a sudden, blinding rush of heat erupted in the center of her chest. Her latent weaver magic, kept dormant for so long, flared to brilliant life. It was not a violent fire. It was a deep, soothing warmth, like sunlight breaking through a winter storm. It flowed from her heart down her arms, pooling in her hands with an undeniable demand to heal, to mend, to protect. It surged through her veins like liquid fire, chasing away the biting cold of the library in a single heartbeat. Her fingertips began to glow with a faint, ethereal gold light. Prince Wren's amber eyes widened drastically. A tiny, almost imperceptible gasp escaped his lips as he felt the wave of radiant healing heat wash over his freezing skin. The thick ice coating the edge of the mahogany desk immediately began to melt, dripping onto the stone floor in small, steady puddles. Lyra picked up the dagger. She did not hesitate. She pressed the razor-sharp edge to the pad of her index finger. A single drop of crimson blood welled up, vibrant and warm against her pale skin. She pressed her bloody finger firmly to the bottom corner of the blank blood treaty. The ancient parchment hissed loudly. The drop of blood spread like living vines, forming intricate, glowing red runes that quickly sank into the fibers of the paper, locking them together. The pact was sealed. The contract was struck. Not used, not owned, chosen, Lyra said, her voice ringing with a newfound quiet authority that echoed off the high-vaulted ceiling. "I will help you." Prince Wren stared at the newly sealed pact, his chest rising and falling rapidly. Then he looked up at her. For the very first time since she had walked into the frozen fortress, the proud, terrifying boy slowly lowered his head in a deep, absolute bow of respect. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the library burst open. A violent blast of winter wind swept into the room, extinguishing the hearth fire instantly. The temperature plummeted so fast that Lyra's breath immediately materialized into thick white clouds of vapor. A massive, terrifying silhouette stood in the doorway. King Alaric had returned. The heavy oak doors did not just open. They were violently thrown back against the stone walls with a deafening crack. A violent blast of winter wind swept into the room, extinguishing the massive hearth fire in a single brutal instant. The temperature plummeted so fast that the ambient moisture in the air froze, falling like diamond dust onto the ancient rugs. A massive, terrifying silhouette stood in the doorway. King Alaric had returned. He was a monolith of dark iron, scarred leather, and absolute, crushing authority. The sovereign of the Northern Wastes stepped over the threshold, and the very foundation of the keep seemed to groan beneath his weight. Frost spiderwebbed rapidly across the stone floor with every heavy step he took. The deadly glacial hex was not merely a rumor. It was a physical, terrifying entity that radiated from his chest, Beneath the dark metal of his breastplate, a faint, sickly blue glow pulsed rhythmically, syncing with the slow, agonizing beat of his frozen heart. His eyes were the color of a raging winter storm, storm gray, merciless, and completely devoid of human warmth. They swept the cavernous library, cutting through the shadows before locking onto the young woman standing near the desk. "Who are you?" It was not a question. It was a command that vibrated the glass of the high-vaulted windows. The sheer baritone force of his voice hit Lyra like a physical blow, demanding total submission. She did not bow, she did not lower her gaze. She folded her hands neatly over the coarse fabric of her grey dress. The radiant inner spark, which had just moments ago flared to life, immediately pulled back, hiding deep within her spiritual core to avoid detection. The air had turned to glass in her lungs. Every instinct of her body screamed at her to drop to her knees, to show the predator her throat. She suppressed the urge with ruthless discipline. Behind her, Prince Wren moved with terrifying precision. Utilizing the blinding gust of wind and his father's imposing distraction, the 7-year-old child deftly folded the ancient parchment. The blank blood treaty vanished into the deep inner pocket of his velvet coat in less than a second. To cover the rustling sound of the heavy paper, the pup intentionally knocked his wooden slate off the desk. It clattered loudly against the frozen stone. The Alpha King's storm grey eyes flicked toward his son. The boy sat perfectly still, his face an unreadable mask of blank apathy, playing the role of the broken mute prince flawlessly. Satisfied that his heir was unharmed, the towering man returned his piercing gaze to the stranger. He closed the distance between them. 3 massive strides. He stopped mere inches from her. The cold rolling off his body was absolute zero. It bit into the governess's exposed cheeks like 1,000 tiny needles. She could see the intricate, jagged patterns of frost clinging to his dark hair and broad shoulders. He leaned down slightly, his towering frame completely eclipsing the dim moonlight streaming through the stained glass windows. He inhaled, a slow, deep breath tasting the air around her. Lyra kept her pulse perfectly steady. If her heart raced, he would hear it. If she sweated, he would smell the fear. She gave him nothing but a wall of quiet dignity. The sovereign frowned, his brow furrowed in stark confusion. He did not smell the usual, sharp, sour stench of terror that accompanied every other scholar who had stood in this room. Instead, he caught the faint, impossible scent of moonflower, cedarwood, and something else. Something that felt like the memory of a summer sun. It was an impossible scent in the dead of winter. A drop of fresh blood lingered faintly beneath it all, but before he could isolate the metallic tang, the chill of the room swallowed it whole. "You do not tremble," the cursed king noted. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble that resonated deep within her bones. "Trembling serves no purpose, my king," the young woman replied evenly. Her tone was factual, devoid of arrogance, yet entirely lacking submission. Alaric stared at her. For a long, agonizing moment, the library was perfectly silent, save for the sound of ice cracking against the window panes. He was used to weeping. He was used to frantic bowing and stammering excuses. This fragile, plainly dressed outsider looked up at him as if he were merely a man, rather than the feared beast of the north. "You are the new governess," he stated, his gaze narrowing. "I am Lyra." "You are remarkably calm for a woman standing in a frozen tomb," he countered, the blue glow beneath his armor flaring slightly. "We will see how long that lasts. My son requires no further instruction today. You will come with me." He did not wait for her compliance. He turned sharply, his heavy cloak snapping behind him like a whip, and marched back toward the towering double doors. The fragile outsider glanced briefly at the child. Wren gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod. The pact was sealed. The secret was safe. She picked up her worn leather satchel, smoothed the front of her modest dress, and followed the terrifying sovereign out into the dark corridors. The journey to the heart of the fortress was a descent into an abyss of shadows. The great hall of Blackwood Keep was a cavernous space designed to humble the proudest alphas. Its ceiling vaulted so high that the torchlight failed to illuminate the ancient, crumbling rafters. The massive columns were carved in the likeness of howling wolves, their stone faces worn smooth by centuries of brutal winters. 200 heavy iron chandeliers hung motionless in the freezing air. The throne, carved entirely from a single block of black obsidian, sat upon a raised dais, radiating a dark, suffocating authority. The towering man ascended the steps and turned, looking down at the young woman who had stopped exactly at the base of the dais. Before he could issue a command, the heavy side doors of the hall swung open. Duchess Vespera glided into the vast room. The former stepmother of the king moved with the predatory grace of a snow leopard. She was wrapped in layers of luxurious, pristine white fur that dragged silently across the polished stone floor. Her face was aristocratically sharp, her lips painted a deep, bruised crimson. There was a smile on her face, but it was pure, poisoned honey. It never reached her calculating, icy blue eyes. Following closely behind her was Commander Hess. The head of the royal guard was a mountain of a man, clad in thick steel plates and heavy wolf pelts. His face was a map of brutal battle scars. As a warrior priest of the realm, his hand rested casually, yet deliberately, on the pommel of his broadsword. He eyed the new arrival with stark, unyielding suspicion. "So this is the new distraction," Vespera purred, her voice echoing sharply off the stone walls. She stopped a few paces away, looking the new governess up and down with blatant disdain. "I expected someone with at least a shred of pedigree, not a stray plucked from the southern gutters." Lyra did not flinch. She kept her hands folded in front of her, her expression an impenetrable mask of calm. "She does not smell of any recognized pack," Hess added, his gruff voice a stark contrast to the noblewoman's smooth venom. He stepped forward, his heavy boots echoing loudly. "She carries no sigil, no scent of a sovereign house. For all we know, she is a spy sent by the southern lords to assess our defenses. Or worse," the Duchess murmured, stepping closer to the quiet outsider, her blue eyes narrowing into slits. "An assassin. The king's condition makes him a prime target for opportunistic scavengers. She is too quiet, too plain. It is the unassuming ones who usually carry the sharpest daggers." The accusations hung in the freezing air, heavy and lethal. In any other royal court, a commoner accused of treason by the high nobility would immediately drop to their knees. They would weep, beg for their lives, and desperately list their meager credentials to prove their innocence. The young woman did neither. She simply stood her ground. Her spine was straight, her shoulders relaxed. She did not offer a frantic defense, because a frantic defense was an admission of vulnerability. Her absolute silence was her armor, and it rippled through the great hall, louder than any scream. She let the older woman's insults crash against her, like waves breaking against an unyielding cliff. Alaric watched her from the obsidian throne. The dark ice of his deadly affliction continued to creep up his neck, yet his storm-grey eyes were locked entirely on the fragile figure below. He watched the way she absorbed the public humiliation without shedding a single tear. He watched the way she refused to break. It fascinated him. It infuriated him. "She will not last a week," the former stepmother continued, turning her back on the governess and looking up at the sovereign. "Throw her back out into the snow, Alaric. The child is a lost cause. You waste your time and our resources bringing these useless scholars to the keep. Let the cold claim her." Enough. The single word from the Alpha dropped the temperature in the hall by another 10 degrees. Vespera snapped her mouth shut, her jaw tight with barely concealed rage. The scarred warrior priest lowered his head in immediate, rigid submission. The cursed king slowly stood up from the throne. The sheer size of him dominated the massive room. He descended the obsidian steps, his eyes never leaving the quiet outsider's face. He stopped when he was close enough to see the steady rise and fall of her chest, close enough to feel the infuriating lack of terror in her pulse. "She does not flinch," the towering man murmured, speaking more to himself than to his court. He leaned in slightly. "Are you truly without fear, little scholar, or are you simply too foolish to understand the danger you are in?" "Understanding danger does not require a display of panic, Your Majesty," she answered softly. Her voice was steady, a quiet melody against the harsh grinding silence of the keep. His jaw clenched. The sickly blue glow in his chest pulsed violently. He could feel the ambient weaver magic hidden deep within her, though he could not identify what it was. He only knew that her very presence grated against his cursed heart, causing a strange phantom ache that he had not felt in years. He turned to his commander. "She remains. The noblewoman's pristine mask slipped for a fraction of a second. "My king! This is madness. You cannot trust. I said she remains," the sovereign roared, the sound echoing like thunder. "But she will not roam freely. Hess, escort the governess to the western nursery wing. Confine her there. She is to remain close to the prince at all times. Guard the corridors. If she is a spy, she will find no secrets trapped in a child's room." The guard slammed his fist against his breastplate in salute. "As you command." The decree was absolute. The forced proximity was established. The Duchess glared at the young woman with a venomous hatred before spinning on her heel and stalking out of the hall, her white furs sweeping furiously behind her. Lyra turned to follow the heavily armored guard. She did not look back at the throne. The Alpha stood motionless on the dais. He watched her leave like a man watching his own heart walk out of his chest. He did not understand the sudden, heavy emptiness that settled over him the moment she walked out of his sight. The western nursery wing of the fortress was even colder than the library. It was a desolate, draughty corridor of high stone walls and narrow barred windows that looked out over the endless frozen tundra. The scarred warrior escorted her in strict silence, his heavy boots crunching against the thin layer of frost that coated the floorboards. He unlocked a heavy oak door near the end of the hall, gesturing for her to enter. "The pup sleeps in the adjoining chamber," the priest stated bluntly. "Your meals will be brought to you. Do not attempt to wander the keep at night. The guards have orders to shoot unrecognized shadows." "Understood," she replied calmly. The large man looked at her for a long moment, his harsh features softening by a microscopic fraction. "The Duchess is not a woman to cross. Keep your head down, governess, for your own sake." He closed the door. The heavy iron lock engaged with a loud, final click. She was alone. The chamber provided to her was stark and unforgiving. A narrow wooden bed pushed against a freezing stone wall, a small, unlit hearth, and a single woven rug that did nothing to stop the chill radiating from the floor. The cold in this wing was not merely weather. It was the epicenter of the deadly affliction, bleeding through the walls from wherever the cursed king resided above them. It was a physical entity, heavy and suffocating, actively trying to crush the life out of anything that dared to breathe. She set her satchel on the floor and sat on the edge of the hard mattress, her breath plumed in thick white clouds. Her fingers were completely numb, the tips turning a dangerous pale blue. If she did not warm her core soon, she would slip into hypothermia before dawn. To care for this royal child, to cure this cursed Alpha, she had to survive the night. Lyra closed her eyes. She took a slow, deep breath, visualizing the golden spool of magic resting at the very bottom of her soul. She carefully, meticulously unspooled a tiny fraction of the radiant warmth. She could not use too much. If she flared her power brightly, the magical wards of the keep would detect her, and the former stepmother would have her executed as a witch before sunrise. She held her numb hands out in front of her chest. Slowly, a brilliant, warm, golden spark ignited between her palms. The magic responded eagerly to her command. It wove itself into intricate, glowing threads of pure sunlight, spinning rapidly to form a small, localized sphere of heat. The warmth washed over her freezing skin, sinking deep into her bones, chasing away the deadly numbness. It was the absolute antithesis of the dark ice. It was life. It was a gentle, fierce protection. Knowing the risk, the young woman immediately muttered a low incantation, casting a standard, southern illusion over the room. To anyone looking through the iron grate of the door, the room would appear perfectly dark, perfectly freezing, and entirely mundane. The golden light would be completely invisible to the naked eye. She sighed softly, letting the ambient warmth cocoon her as she prepared to rest. But Lyra didn't know the Alpha King could see through glamours. Outside in the dark, frozen corridor, Alaric stood perfectly still. He had dismissed his guards and walked the silent halls alone, driven by a restless, gnawing ache in his chest that he could not explain. The frozen hex was exceptionally cruel tonight, biting into his lungs like shattered glass. He had come to the nursery wing to inspect the new prisoner, to ensure she was not a threat to his silent son. He stopped outside her heavy oak door. He looked through the iron grate. He did not see a dark freezing room. The cheap southern illusion fractured instantly against the ancient sovereign power of his storm-grey eyes. Instead, he saw a miracle. He saw the plain, unassuming governess, bathed in a halo of radiant, spinning gold light. The threads of magic danced around her fingers, casting warm, beautiful shadows against the harsh stone walls. It was a power he had only read about in forbidden scrolls, the mythical force capable of altering fate itself and melting the most ancient of curses. The sheer beauty of the golden warmth hit him like a physical blow, but it was not just a visual spectacle. The moment he laid eyes on her true, uncloaked magic, the dark ice inside his chest violently rebelled. A sharp, agonizing pain erupted behind his ribs, so intense that the towering sovereign actually staggered backward, slamming his broad shoulder into the stone wall. He gasped, gripping the frozen metal of his breastplate. The affliction fought a sudden, terrifying influx of phantom heat. The mate bond, buried beneath centuries of royal duty and cold despair, twitched in its sleep. He watched her through the bars, his breath coming in ragged, painful bursts. The warmth she radiated was the only thing in the world that could save him. And yet, the curse fought it, tearing at his insides, punishing him for daring to crave the light. To allow her close was to risk everything. To banish her was to guarantee his own death. This desperate longing is tearing my soul apart. The dark curse seemed to whisper the brutal truth through his veins, the agonizing ache spreading up his throat. The king squeezed his eyes shut, his massive frame trembling in the dark corridor. He would not expose her secret tonight. He could not. His monstrous condition demanded isolation, but the man trapped beneath the ice had finally seen the sun. I would rather burn with you than freeze alone. The thought was a dangerous, traitorous whisper in the back of his mind. The cursed king pushed himself off the wall, his heavy boots making no sound as he retreated back into the abyssal shadows of his frozen keep, leaving the radiant golden weaver entirely unaware of the lethal obsession she had just awakened. The midnight bell of Blackwood Keep tolled, a hollow, mournful sound that was quickly swallowed by the screaming blizzard outside. Lyra lay awake on the narrow, unforgiving mattress. Sleep was an impossible luxury. The stone walls of the nursery wing radiated a cold so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing directly down on her chest. She watched her own breath materialize into thick, white plumes rising slowly toward the dark vaulted ceiling. The small, localized sphere of warmth she had conjured hours ago had long since faded, leaving her entirely exposed to the keep's merciless atmosphere. She pulled the coarse wool blanket tighter around her shoulders, trying to ignore the dull, creeping ache settling deep into her joints. Then a sound broke through the relentless howl of the wind. It was not the creak of settling stone, it was a fragile, ragged wheeze. A desperate, wet gasp for air coming from the adjoining chamber. The governess threw off her blanket and moved. She did not bother to search for a candle or a heavy cloak. Her bare feet hit the freezing floorboards, the frost biting instantly into her skin as she crossed the short distance to the heavy oak door, separating her from the royal pup. She pushed it open. The ambient temperature in the child's room was significantly worse. It hit her like a solid wall of ice, instantly stealing the air from her lungs. Prince Wren was thrashing violently beneath a massive mountain of heavy wolf pelts. The 7-year-old was not merely shivering, he was convulsing. A sickly, pale blue frost had crystallized over his cracked lips, and jagged, unnatural lines of solid ice were rapidly spiderwebbing up the delicate veins of his small neck. His rare amber eyes were rolled back, showing only the whites in the dim moonlight. His jaw was locked tight. He could not scream. His inherent muteness trapped the sheer, unspeakable agony entirely inside his tiny, failing body. Lyra did not panic. She did not run out into the dark corridors to scream for the royal physicians or the scarred guard commander. She knew exactly what she was witnessing. This was not a natural winter sickness. The deadly hex carried in his father's cursed bloodline was aggressively trying to claim the air, actively freezing him from the inside out. She knelt on the frozen rug beside the massive 4-poster bed. She immediately threw off the thick, suffocating furs. They were entirely useless against a magical affliction. The young woman closed her eyes and reached deep into the absolute center of her spiritual core. The weaver magic, usually kept tightly coiled and completely hidden to avoid the Duchess's suspicion, answered her silent, desperate call. She bypassed the subtle, invisible threads she typically used for mere survival. This moment required raw, unfiltered power. She opened her eyes. A brilliant, blinding river of molten gold poured directly from her palms. She pressed her bare, glowing hands against the boy's freezing chest. The reaction was instantaneous. The ancient magic sank entirely through his skin, a fierce, blazing current of pure sunlight, colliding violently with the dark ice infecting his blood. The child arched off the mattress, a silent, breathless gasp tearing from his blue lips as the conflicting temperatures warred inside his lungs. Slowly, meticulously, she began to stitch the warmth back into his failing organs. She did not just hover over him like a clinical healer. She climbed onto the edge of the mattress and wrapped her arms completely around his rigid, freezing frame, pulling him tightly against her own chest. She absorbed the biting, lethal chill radiating from his bones, offering her own fragile life force as a living shield against the creeping frost. "I am here," she whispered into his dark, sweat-dampened hair. Her voice was perfectly steady, a quiet anchor in the raging storm. "You are safe. I will not let it take you." The boy's violent tremors began to slow. The unnatural, jagged ice retracted from his veins, melting rapidly into harmless, warm beads of water that soaked the collar of her plain grey dress. His small hands, which had been curled into tight, agonizing fists, finally unfurled. His fingers found the fabric of her sleeve and gripped it with desperate, crushing strength. He buried his face deep into the curve of her neck, clinging to the only source of absolute warmth he had ever encountered in this miserable, shadowed fortress. The scent of sharp ozone, crushed cedarwood, and blooming moonflower filled the small chamber, completely overriding the sterile, metallic smell of the frost. She rocked him slowly in the dark, her golden power wrapping around them both like a luminous, protective cocoon. The heavy iron hinges of the nursery door suddenly groaned. King Alaric stepped into the room. He had been pacing the abyssal corridors of the western wing for hours, driven by a restless, gnawing ache in his chest that he could not rationally explain. When the ambient temperature in the hallway had violently plummeted, he knew the affliction had struck his son. He had breached the door expecting to find a devastating tragedy. He had expected to find the fragile new scholar, cowering in the corner, weeping over the frozen corpse of the kingdom's only remaining heir. His broadsword was already drawn, the dark, lethal steel gleaming menacingly in the shadows. He stopped dead. The massive, towering predator froze entirely in his tracks. The point of the heavy blade slowly lowered, until it rested harmlessly against the stone floor. There was no death in the room. There was no terror. The outsider was sitting on the edge of the mattress, cradling the deeply sleeping boy against her chest. The blinding, radiant light of her magic was just beginning to fade, the last few golden sparks dissolving softly into the young woman's pale skin. The air in the chamber was unnaturally warm, a stark, shocking contrast to the lethal winter raging directly outside the thick window panes. The sovereign stared. His storm-grey eyes widened fractionally, taking in a completely impossible reality. His mute pup, the wild, broken child who recoiled violently from every touch, who snarled at the castle maids and bit the royal physicians, was fast asleep. His breathing was deep, rhythmic, and perfectly even. A healthy, natural flush of colour had returned to his previously pale cheeks. He looked peaceful. He looked like a normal, cherished child, safe in the unconditional arms of a mother. Alaric's chest heaved. The dark iron of his breastplate suddenly felt excruciatingly tight against his massive ribs. He took a slow, heavy step forward, his boots making absolutely no sound on the stone. He looked past the child and locked his gaze entirely onto the governess. Her face was visibly pale, drained from the sheer exertion of channeling so much raw, unmitigated power, yet her posture remained unbroken. She did not flinch as the massive, lethal ruler of the North approached her in the dark. She did not scramble backward. She did not beg for her life or attempt to frantically explain her forbidden abilities. She simply looked up at him and brought a single trembling finger to her lips, a universal quiet demand for absolute silence. "Do not wake the child." The fearsome beast obeyed. For the first time in over a decade, the ruthless alpha felt something other than burning rage or suffocating, endless despair. A profound, overwhelming wave of pure gratitude crashed violently into his cursed heart. It was so intense, so entirely foreign to his nature, that it physically stole his breath. He looked at his living, breathing air, and then at the quiet, unassuming woman who had physically fought back the absolute grip of death with nothing but her bare hands. His cold, impenetrable facade finally cracked. The merciless warlord vanished entirely, leaving only a terrified, deeply relieved father standing silently in the shadows. He sheathed his sword. The metallic scrape was smooth, controlled, and deeply reverent. He did not issue a single sovereign command. He simply stood at the foot of the bed and watched the steady rise and fall of his son's chest, anchoring his fractured mind to the impossible warmth she had somehow brought into his frozen tomb. After a long, suspended silence, Lyra gently detached herself from the sleeping boy. She meticulously adjusted the heavy pelts, pulling them up over his small shoulders and tucking the edges firmly beneath the mattress to ensure he remained completely secure. She stood up, her bare feet silent against the rug, and walked slowly into the main sitting area of the nursery. A large dormant fireplace dominated the far stone wall, its hearth filled only with cold grey ashes and the bitter memory of fire. The towering man followed her. He crossed the threshold, and his massive frame immediately seemed to swallow all the remaining space in the small, austere room. "The fever has broken. He will sleep deeply until dawn," she stated softly, her voice remaining barely a whisper in the quiet space. She did not turn around to face him. She kept her gaze fixed on the empty hearth, quietly rubbing her own chilled fingers together to restore her failing circulation. The Alpha did not answer immediately. He took another deliberate step closer. The physical proximity was entirely suffocating. The sheer, heavy aura of his sovereign power pressed firmly against her skin, an instinctual, predatory force that naturally demanded total submission from any lesser wolf. Yet, beneath that terrifying, lethal exterior, there was a violent, erratic tremor. A sharp, jagged sound suddenly broke from his throat, a suppressed, guttural groan of pure, undiluted agony. The sickly blue glow beneath his dark armor flared with blinding, vicious intensity. The frost clinging to his broad shoulders thickened instantly, rapidly, crawling up the scarred leather of his collar and digging ruthlessly into his neck. The deadly hex was actively punishing him. It was violently reacting to the lingering magic in the room, tearing relentlessly at his ribcage, desperately trying to freeze the sudden, traitorous warmth that was blooming uncontrollably inside him. The towering sovereign staggered. He pitched forward slightly, bracing one massive, leather-clad hand heavily against the stone mantel of the fireplace to keep himself upright. His head bowed, his breath coming in rapid, ragged gasps that instantly materialized into thick clouds of falling ice. Instinctively, the young woman turned. She took a step toward him, her hand raising automatically to bridge the gap. A faint, residual golden spark danced across her delicate fingertips. She wanted to ease his terrible pain. She wanted to reach out, to touch the freezing metal of his breastplate, and unravel the dark, suffocating threads wrapping so cruelly around his failing heart. "Do not touch me." The command was raw, bleeding, and entirely broken. It was not a royal threat. It was a desperate, agonizing plea. He turned his head slightly, his storm-grey eyes locking directly onto hers. The sheer torment in his gaze was laid completely bare, stripped of all arrogance, all pack pride, and all sovereign pretense. "The closer you are, the harder it fights," he rasped, his baritone voice vibrating with barely contained agony. He closed his eyes, his massive shoulders shaking visibly as the supernatural ice drove deeper into his flesh, viciously rejecting the innate heat of the mate bond that was desperately trying to awaken between them. "Caring about you is killing me." The words hung heavy and lethal in the freezing air. A stark, brutal confession from a king who had never admitted weakness, never shown physical vulnerability, to a single living soul in his entire reign. Lyra lowered her hand slowly, letting the golden spark fade completely into the shadows, but she did not step back. She did not retreat from the terrifying beast of the north, who was currently waging a brutal, unwinnable war inside his own body just to keep her safe from his affliction. Her expression remained perfectly calm, but a fierce, unyielding resolve settled deep into her bones. She looked up at the scarred, cursed man who would rather suffer absolute, mind-shattering agony than risk harming her with his frozen touch. "There is no wolf too broken to be worthy," she answered quietly. He let out a harsh, bitter breath, the vapor turning to solid ice before it even reached the floorboards. He did not agree with her impossible optimism. He knew exactly what he was, a dying monster destined to freeze entirely alone in the dark, but he did not leave the room. He did not order her away to protect himself. They stood together in the shadows, separated by a single foot of freezing air, bound tightly by a silent, deadly connection that neither of them could possibly escape. Dawn arrived grey and cold, bleeding through the narrow Gothic windows of the western nursery wing like bruised iron. Heavy clouds offered no warmth, only a suffocating, pale light stretched distorted shadows across the ancient stone walls. Before the sun could fully breach the horizon, the fragile peace shattered. Rhythmic thuds of armored boots echoed down the abyssal corridor. A synchronized march demanding total submission. Standing silently behind the heavy oak door, Lyra did not tremble, not even when the ambient temperature plummeted to a freezing sting. Sharp, calculated clicks of aristocratic heels mixed with the rattle of drawn steel. Pine and metallic blood seeped under the doorframe. Duchess Vespera had arrived. Skipping royal pleasantries, the former stepmother halted directly outside the nursery. Her voice sliced through the freezing air like poisoned honey. "Remove the abomination," Duchess Vespera commanded. Generations of unchallenged authority dripped from her tone. She has infected the boy's mind. The perimeter guards reported a blinding, unnatural light emanating from this wing during the night. "She is practicing forbidden arts right under your roof, King Alaric. She is a threat to the sovereign crown." Rigidly standing beside the Duchess, Commander Hess kept his weathered face drawn tight with internal conflict. He had sworn a blood oath to protect the sovereign line, yet his deep wolf instincts screamed that the quiet governess was not the true enemy. King Alaric did not step aside. Broad and leather-clad, the imposing alpha blocked the doorway entirely. His shoulders formed an impenetrable barricade between the encroaching court and Prince Wren sleeping inside. Sickly blue ice from the ancient affliction clung fiercely to his iron breastplate, a terrifying reminder of his agonizing condition, yet his posture remained terrifyingly dominant. He did not yield a single inch. "The governess stays," King Alaric stated. His baritone was a low, lethal rumble that vibrated against the stone floor. It was not a debate. It was a sovereign decree. Meticulously painted lips thinned into a vicious sneer. "You are letting a stray, nameless cur dictate the future of Blackwood Keep," Vespera snapped. "She is a weaver, a parasite of fate. And for what? To comfort a defective pup who cannot even speak his own name?" Scoffing loudly, the noblewoman stepped closer. "The boy is broken. Alaric. He is utterly useless to the throne. You are risking the survival of our entire lineage for a weak, silent mistake." The air had turned to glass in her lungs. Lyra held her breath behind the timber. Her heart throbbed with a fierce, protective fury for the innocent child, sleeping just feet away. She waited for the merciless warlord to agree with his stepmother, to succumb to ruthless pack logic. She braced herself for the inevitable betrayal. Instead, King Alaric drew his broadsword. The lethal scrape of dark steel against its leather scabbard deafened the enclosed space. "My son breathes," the sovereign growled. Storm-grey eyes burned with unholy wrath as he leveled the heavy blade directly at the Duchess's throat. "And the woman who ensured it will remain exactly where she is. Under my protection, even the most deeply scarred deserve their place." He threw the quiet scholar's profound conviction back at the treacherous court. Vespera stiffened, her arrogant facade fractured under the suffocating weight of his predatory aura. Staring at the lethal tip of the blade, she sneered. "A mistake is when you do not know what you are doing. A choice is when you do, and you do it anyway." Vespera had made her choice. "You are sealing your own doom," she hissed softly. The venomous serpent beneath finally revealed itself. "The Frostheart curse will consume you both. When you are dead, I will take the boy myself." Spinning on her heel, she marched away. Dark velvet skirts snapped around her ankles. Lingering for a fraction of a second, Commander Hess offered a short, deeply respectful bow to the king. A silent acknowledgement of the Alpha's unprecedented choice. He turned to follow the enraged noblewoman back into the shadows. Oppressive silence returned. Slowly lowering his weapon, King Alaric stood alone. His broad chest heaved as the dark magic punished him for his protective rage. Pressing her forehead against the freezing wood, Lyra let her eyes slip shut. He saw the inherent value in the discarded and the silent. He had just declared open war against his own family to protect a nameless maid and a mute child. The line was drawn. Loyalty snapped firmly into place within her weaver soul. She would not let him die. 3 weeks later, the morning of the winter solstice brought a sky of bruised, impenetrable black. It was the darkest, most merciless day of the year. The Frostheart curse launched its final, devastating assault upon the royal bloodline. Temperatures inside Blackwood Keep dropped to an unsurvivable extreme. Ancient hearths in the great hall extinguished themselves. Roaring flames froze into jagged sculptures of red and orange ice. Stone walls groaned under the atmospheric pressure. Intricate tapestries shattered like fragile glass. Sitting beside the iron-framed window in the nursery, Lyra felt the severe shift hit. The air turned so cold it burned the inside of her lungs. Water in her porcelain wash basin crystallized in less than a second. An earth-shattering roar echoed from the eastern wing. It was a visceral, guttural scream of pure agony. "Alaric," she whispered. She did not hesitate. The young governess bolted from the room. Bare feet hit the ice-covered stones as she sprinted recklessly down the abyssal corridors. She ignored the sharp bite of freezing air tearing at her skin. Running silently right beside her was Prince Wren. The 7-year-old pup's rare amber eyes were wide with terror, but his small jaw was set with fierce determination. He clutched the Blackwood crest dagger tightly in his hands. The silver blade gleamed in the dim light. Together, they breached the heavy oak doors of the sovereign's private chambers. King Alaric was on his knees in the center of the room. He was rapidly becoming winter itself. A glacier of dark blue ice had erupted from his chest. It tore through his leather armor, locking his ribcage into an impenetrable block. The terrifying hex aggressively crawled up his neck. It crystallized his jaw, his throat, and the tears on his pale cheeks. Storm-grey eyes locked directly onto the governess as she burst through the doors. He could not speak. The ice had permanently sealed his lips. His panicked gaze screamed a single, desperate command: run. Everyone expected her to crumble, to weep, to flee. She did none of those things. Sprinting across the frozen floorboards, Lyra dropped heavily to her bruised knees right in front of the dying sovereign. Ambient cold radiating from his body blistered her skin. "Wren now," she shouted. The mute prince dropped to the freezing rug beside her. He did not flinch from the horrifying sight of his father. The brave child grabbed King Alaric's freezing left hand with both of his own. Closing her eyes, Lyra unleashed everything. She tore open the protected core of her soul. An inferno of pure weaver magic erupted from her chest, manifesting as a thick physical cable of blazing sunlight. The brilliant strand of destiny materialized in the freezing air. It hummed with a frequency that rattled the heavy stone walls. Grabbing the luminous cord with bare hands, she drove it directly into the solid glacier encasing Alaric's failing heart. The ancient ice screamed. It emitted a high-pitched shriek that shattered every glass pane in the chamber simultaneously. Dark magic fought back, sending jagged spikes of supernatural frost shooting up Lyra's arms. Cold pierced her veins like needles. It was freezing her blood, her vision blurred. The edges of the room turned black. She was losing the battle against the overwhelming winter. Then, a sudden fierce warmth flooded her right side. Prince Wren had let go of his father's hand and grabbed Lyra's wrist. Dormant and suppressed by years of trauma, the young boy's inherent alpha bloodline suddenly ignited beneath his skin. He funneled raw, untamed pack strength directly into her failing weaver magic. The sovereign healing magic flared with blinding, catastrophic brilliance. "You will not take him," Lyra screamed. She pushed the blazing, molten length of the golden fate thread entirely through the dark ice. It pierced the very center of the king's cursed chest. It locked directly onto the final beat of his heart. The sudden collision of zero temperatures and pure sunlight triggered a concussive shockwave of steam and raw energy. The blast threw Lyra and Prince Wren backward across the rug. Darkness claimed her. Groaning, Lyra pushed herself up from the damp floorboards with trembling arms. Her entire body ached profoundly. She blinked rapidly as the heavy steam cleared. The oppressive, suffocating cold was completely gone. The jagged glacier that had encased the sovereign's chest had vanished, leaving only a wide pool of steaming, warm water soaking deeply into the heavy rugs. The air in the chamber was no longer a lethal weapon. It was thick, heavy, and intensely warm. It carried the faint, sweet scent of blooming moonflower. In the center of the room, King Alaric lay flat on his back. His broad chest heaved with deep, unobstructed breaths. He slowly pushed himself up. The dark, sickly blue glow beneath his skin had entirely disappeared. His scarred face was flushed with natural, vibrant color. Looking down at his own hands, he flexed his fingers. The Frostheart curse was completely broken. A small, frantic blur of motion darted past Lyra. Prince Ren threw himself directly at the towering Alpha. He crashed heavily into his father's chest, wrapping trembling arms tightly around the king's thick neck. King Alaric choked on a sharp breath. The terrifying warlord instantly wrapped his arms around his son, burying his face deep into the child's dark hair. His shoulders shook. He wept with the crushing relief of a father who had just been handed his entire world back from the abyss. Then, a sound broke the quiet intimacy of the room. "Thank you." The voice was raspy, fragile, and entirely unused. It came from the small boy buried in the king's embrace. Lyra froze. Her breath caught sharply in her throat. The mute prince had spoken. The sheer warmth of the broken curse had not just melted the ice in the ancient castle. It had shattered the psychological wall inside the child's traumatized mind. Pulling back slightly, King Alaric stared down at his son with wide, disbelieving, storm-grey eyes. The boy looked up at him with a small, hesitant smile, then turned his head to look directly at the young governess. "Thank you," Prince Ren repeated. His voice was stronger this time. The Alpha King looked at Lyra. The sheer intensity in his gaze was no longer terrifying or guarded. It was devastatingly tender. It was a look of unconditional surrender from a man who had spent his entire life fighting alone. Gently setting his son down, he stood up. He walked slowly across the damp rug, his heavy boots splashing softly in the melted ice. He stopped directly in front of her. The undisputed ruler of the North, a terrifying beast who had never bowed to another living soul, lowered his head and dropped heavily to both knees right in front of her. "I have nothing left to hide behind," King Alaric murmured. His deep baritone trembled with raw emotion. Reaching out, his incredibly warm hands gently cradled her bruised, bloody fingers. The contrast of his intense heat against her chilled skin sent an electrifying shockwave straight through the newly forged mate bond. He looked up, his storm-grey eyes burning with fierce devotion. "I would rather burn with you than freeze alone. You fought the dark when I had surrendered to it. You protected my blood when my own pack condemned it as broken." Pressing his forehead gently against the back of her hands, he sealed the truth of his claim with a shuddering breath. "Not used, not owned. Chosen. You are not a governess, Lyra, you never were. You are my weaver, my mate, my true queen." The golden fate thread inside her chest thrummed with a beautiful finality. The cruel rejection of her past dissolved in the overwhelming warmth of his touch. She had not just survived the frozen wastes, she had conquered them entirely. Leaning forward, she pressed her forehead gently against his. The hollow halls of Blackwood Keep were never cold again. They say the ancient stones still radiate the warmth of a single blazing sun, a permanent reminder of the quiet maid who stitched a broken family back together. And if you walk the high corridors in the dead of winter, you will never feel the bite of the freezing cold. You will only feel the fierce, protective heat of a true sovereign union. Thank you so much for listening to the story of Lyra and Alaric. If you enjoyed watching this broken family find their fierce, protective warmth and conquering the frozen wastes together, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more dark, gothic romances. Tell me your favorite moment down in the comments. I read every single one, and your words mean more than you know. Until next time, stay warm.